And we're live. Welcome to the Modern Web Podcast. I'm your host, Jay Phelps. And today we're going to talk about testing, everything testing, all sorts of stuff. And joining me, we've got the Modern Web Podcast. Well, one moment. Host, Jay Phelps. We've got Gil Tayar. Gil, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Gil Tayar. You got the name right, which is nice. I'm a senior software architect for Applitools and developer relations. Do lots of conferences, etc. For me, the term senior software architect is the term people like me who have like more than 30 years of experience have when they're not allowed to call themselves just software developers. But that is me. Always was, will, and am a software developer. Love it. Love the work and doing really good things for testing at Applitools.
Awesome. And next we have Kent C Dodds. Kent Chimichanga Dodds.
Hey, what's going on? So yeah, I'm Kent C Dodds, and I'm a software engineer at PayPal. I represent PayPal on the TC39, though I haven't gone to meetings recently, but do a little bit with that. I do a lot in the open source community. That's where lots of my testing stuff is going on right now. And I'm an instructor on Egghead. I'm working on a huge testing course right now with Egghead. It's gonna be like, it's going to blow everybody's socks off. It's so comprehensive, really, I'm really excited about it. But I also have a course on front-end masters about testing. And I do some workshops for workshop.me. Yeah, I'm a Google developer expert for web, and I'm married and have 4 kids and a dog. And I just have,
how do you get time for any of that?
I have a very supportive and helpful wife, and she's just awesome. So she doesn't get enough credit. Yeah, I just really, and then I don't have any hobbies. I hang out with my family and I code, and that's pretty much it.
Software is your hobby, just like me.
Yeah, who walks the dog?
I walk the dog sometimes. I'll listen to Brandon Sanderson novels as I walk the dog, and that's how I get my Brandon Sanderson fix. So
cool. So if anyone has any questions, if you're listening live, you're able to use the chat on just to the right of the video, and you can ask us any specific questions you'd like. But to get started, Kent, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about the React testing library. I've seen you tweet about this a couple times, seen some people talk about it. I know very little about it. So first, can you kind of tell me actually what the heck it is and why I should care about it? And then also just why you made it to begin with.
Sure. Yeah. So like, that's a really common question that I get. Like, why did you make it? Because React, the ecosystem already has a solid solution for testing. It's Enzyme. And I was getting ready to teach my testing workshop, and I just kind of felt like teaching Enzyme was jumping through a lot of hoops and trying to explain away a lot of extra APIs that I thought like I was going to say, okay, so this API exists, don't ever use it because it encourages you to test implementation details of your components. And so I didn't want to spend so much time explaining like which APIs to use and which ones not to use. For example, like there's one API where you can find elements that you've rendered, and you can find them by the display name of the component or by the component class as well. And so like that's a huge implementation detail right there. Like the user doesn't care at all what your component is called, or like even that there are multiple components. And so like all they care about is they want to be able to find the username input, so they can type their username. Right. So anyway, as I was getting this workshop ready, I built some utilities around Enzyme to just be like, you use these utilities and you'll be testing things in a maintainable way. And then I realized I didn't need Enzyme for that, so I just React DOM to render stuff. And then I thought, you know what, these utilities are actually really useful, and it'd be more useful to teach people to use a library than to just like copy paste utilities everywhere. So I made a library, and that's where React Testing Library came from.
Okay.
so the guiding principle of the library is that and this is something I really, really strongly believe, and it is the more your tests resemble the way your software is used, the more confidence they can give you. And we write tests for lots of reasons. Like you might write tests to enhance your workflow, but I think probably one of the biggest reasons that we write tests is for confidence in shipping our applications. And so like we talk a lot about distinctions between unit integration and end-to-end tests and accessibility testing and like all of these different forms of testing. But at the end of the day, all that I really care about is that I can ship my code to production and feel confident that I'm not breaking anything with the changes I'm making. And testing allows me to do that. So like whatever form of testing you're doing, just like all I really care about is that like, is this giving me confidence? And so that's the whole premise behind the React testing library, is that it gives you utilities that will enable you to test your software in a way that resembles the way that it's used. So,
Gil, have you had a chance to use his new library?
I never had a chance to use it. I'm now into back-end development more than front-end, but I wish I did have it when I did front-end. I like a couple of things about the library. First of all, it's tiered. So there's React testing library, and underneath it there's the DOM testing library, which is like lower level. And I love this idea of having small libraries exactly for their functionality, and then build something higher level that is specific to React and gives you even more convenience. So that is one thing I love about it. The idea of using it as a person would, like searching for the label or for whatever is novel, and I like it. And I totally agree with Kent here. There are two camps in testing. There's what I call the DHH camp and the purist camps. The purist camp believes that testing is like there's one way to do it, and they have all these terminologies, etc. And for them, testing is not just a way to get confidence. It's actually a way to design the code and everything. And then there's the DHH camp, which says, they say, and I say, and I think Ken says, I don't care. I mean, the way you have good tests and enough tests is that you can ship your code without, and go to sleep without worrying about it. And that's the confidence camp, and I'm totally in that. I don't care if it's end-to-end, how many end-to-ends, etc. I have rules of thumb there, but they're rules of thumb, and the end result is just push to production and go to sleep.
I want to mention one thing about that DOM testing library that was referenced. So like when I created React testing library in the first place, the idea was that I'd render a component and then give you back a utility called getByTestID. And then you would add a data test ID attribute to any element that you wanted to select in your test. That's how it started. And the idea there was that a data test ID was a lot more reliable than a class name or something, which like you're overloading the use of these class names, right? We've decided class names are how we're going to be styling our stuff, right? So I felt a lot more comfortable with data test ID. But somebody commented on a blog post that I wrote about that and said, hey, listen, this is actually not good. Like, first of all, you're changing your source code for testing purposes, which I agree is not generally a good practice. Like generally you want to avoid that. But in addition, there are other selectors that you can use that are like accessibility, like screen readers and stuff use those things. And so you can get additional confidence that your test can give you additional confidence if you use some query selectors for stuff like that. So now we have get by label text. We have even get by text, get by placeholder text. So lots of these different selectors that are available to you. And as I built out these queries, I realized that they were actually totally React agnostic, just like they were just querying the DOM. And so that's when I extracted those queries into its own little package called DOM testing library. And since doing that, somebody built a Vue testing library. Another person built I think they called it NGX testing library for Angular 2, well, 2 and up. I don't even know, Angular. And
it's just Angular.
Yeah, it's just Angular. And then like just for fun, I built a backbone testing library the other day and a hyper app testing library. So there are all these different ways that you can build these very simple testing libraries on top of the DOM testing library. And that's actually one thing I'm going to add to my course when it comes out, is I'll have an example of how to use each one of these testing libraries with each one of these frameworks, because like the core concepts and ideas are absolutely framework agnostic. And I think that's one of the things that brings it back to the core principle, is that like the user doesn't care that your application is using React or Backbone or like Aurelia or whatever. They don't really care. All they care about is can I find that username input, and can I type in my username? Can I find that submit button and click on that? And that's what these like DOM testing library and like whether you're using these libraries specifically, I don't care. What I'm mostly interested in is like is your test doing the same kinds of things that the user of your component would do. Another thing to just really briefly mention about that is when we're talking about testing, like I'm not advocating that all of your tests should be just like a user point and click and whatever. And lots of my tests are rendering a specific component because we've got edge cases we want to deal with on a component. And unit testing is totally a cool thing. Like we should be doing that too to catch lots of these edge cases. And so when we're talking about the way our software is used, we have to remember that the component is actually part of our software, and the component exposes an API, and that's and the user of that is another developer. And so, yeah, sure, you can render your whole application and point and click around and stuff if you want to do that. But at some point, it's a good idea to just render a single component, and you interact with that just like a developer would. And so to render that, they're going to pass it props or whatever. And then an end user is going to interact with it in the DOM and things like that. So I think it's important to not only recognize that your software should, or your test should resemble the way your software is used, but also like who are the users of your software when like thinking about how to test our stuff.
Okay. So just for a little bit of clarity, I always like to ask this question. So there's lots of different terms that get floated around. Things like unit tests, acceptance tests, integration tests, smoke tests, black box tests, visual tests. Can I actually am interested in collectively figuring out kind of a quick definition for each of us for some of these terms. Like, where's the distinction between an acceptance tests and an integration tests, for example?
I have two definitions for each, by the way.
You have two different what?
Put 3 developers in a room, they'll probably have 5 definitions for each one of them.
Exactly. So we don't really need to define them, but I guess the thing I struggle with is I've been doing programming forever, and I still couldn't give you a definitive definition between some of these things. And specifically, like I used to think that I had definitions for them, but then certain communities I joined used the same term but used it completely in a different way, and I'm like, well now I like threw all my knowledge out the window as far as what is an acceptance test, for example. I guess it doesn't really matter at the end of the day what they're called, as long as you have them. But would you guys think that, would you lean more towards the acceptance and black box type of testing versus unit testing? Or I have a feeling Gil's going to lean to visual testing because of Applitools.
No. Let's leave that for later. I'll try and give you my definition, and there are hundreds of these kinds of tests, and everybody has a different definition. So I've given up. I've totally given up. I'm just doing. I'm throwing them into 3 buckets, and I don't care anymore. And the 3 buckets are unit, integration, and end-to-end. And yes, I know there are lots of others, but everybody doesn't agree about them. And for me, the 3 of them are unit tests, just one unit, whether it's a function, a module, a component, test that and that only. That's unit tests. Integration is 2 things. Test more than one unit as combined, so glue them together as you would in an application and test that. Plus the fact that integration tests do I/O. A unit test should not do I/O. And in front-end, I/O is, mostly AJAX calls, HTTP fetch requests. So yes, do those, test those. You have to test them in mocks because you don't really have a server, but test them. End-to-end, for me in front-end, is just test the whole application as a user would using browser automation. And I'm specifically talking about browser automation. So Selenium, Puppeteer, Cypress, whatever, just test them in the browser. And I totally agree. There should be very, very little end-to-end tests, much, much more integration tests. And I'll talk about that later with JSTOM. And unit tests, well, there are two camps. Less unit tests and more unit tests. Doesn't really matter. So the pyramid / diamond / trophy of testing, I'm good with those definitions, and I don't care about the others because nobody else tends to agree on them.
Yeah, I would kind of go with Gil on this one. So I actually gave a talk at FluentConf. It was just a lightning talk, their 5-minute Ignite talks. And you can find that on my website. But it was called what we can learn from testing what we can learn about testing from the wheel. And I just give it's mostly a bunch of GIFs of people doing funny things with the wheels. But I talk about lots of the distinctions between these forms of testing. When most of my work and most of my testing knowledge revolves around front end and JavaScript. I do a fair amount of back end at PayPal and in my own stuff, but most of my stuff is front end. And so when I'm talking about unit tests, I'm talking about a single component. You mock everything, slice off that connection. And when you do that, you're actually slicing off any confidence that those things are working with those things, which is why I don't do as many unit tests. Then when I'm talking about integration tests, I'm talking about integrating multiple React components together. And so I know lots of people refer to integration tests as like two services talking to each other. And I think that's too, but I don't do a whole lot of that myself. And then end-to-end, and for both unit and integration tests, I generally don't hit the network at all. Those I'll just mock out the network calls. And then for end-to-end tests, it's the full suite, front end, back end, everything. And generally, if it's possible, I think it's a really great idea if the automation test that you write can work with the network turned off. And so all services should be like in Docker containers, whatever, everything that you need should be able to run on my local box without me connected to the internet. That enables me to run the tests locally. It enables me to ensure that if there's a breakage that I know I can more easily debug what the problem is. That isn't to say that there isn't value in tests that do communicate across the network. There definitely is value there. But most of the tests that I write and most of the tests that I think are going to give me really good value and return on my investment are the ones that I can run entirely on my local machine. And so, yeah, those are the three. I would add one more form of testing that we don't normally talk about when we're talking about automated testing, but that's static type analysis or static code analysis, whether that's typing tools like TypeScript or FlowType or an entirely different language that compiles to JavaScript. And then
or compiles to WebAssembly.
Or compiles to WebAssembly. Yeah, compiles to a browser runnable language, I guess, or binary.
Sorry, I'm for the viewers who don't know, I'm obsessed with WebAssembly. That's why.
Yeah, I'm loving seeing all this Twitter stuff about WebAssembly from you. Yeah, and then also a linter like ESLint. So those are definitely forms of testing. And if you have those in place, then it actually removes the need to have a whole category of tests. Like, what happens if I send this function a number? You probably don't have tests for that. And you might actually need tests for that. But if you're using a static type checker, then you are covering that case. You don't need to worry about it. So I would suggest that people that's the easiest form of testing to implement, especially ESLint. You just npm install it and start adding rules and stuff. But it's definitely the easiest form of testing to add to your project. It doesn't give you any confidence as to your business logic working properly. That's what the other forms of testing are for. But it definitely, like, it removes a whole category of tests that you never need to write. So I definitely recommend people include that.
Cool. So we've got our first question. Paul asks, did Gil mention having few end-to-end tests? If so, does one just test general usage, or should one test for edge cases in your end-to-end tests?
Oh, definitely, definitely one happy path or two. Do not test for edge cases and end-to-end. That's a huge, huge rule of thumb, but it's really, really important. If you have edge cases, do them in unit tests, and if you can't, then in integration tests. End-to-end tests should be like these 3, 4, 5 happy path flows that go through your application, and just do random stuff, and that's it.
Can you give us a concrete example of like a perfect end-to-end test, like make up an app or think of an existing app or something like that, like Facebook or Instagram or something?
Right. So Facebook, you just log in, maybe register, log in, then you create a post, view your feed, and comment on a post and like it, and you're done. Probably Facebook will need more because it's a huge, huge, huge app. But most of our apps aren't that huge. So go through the main flows of your application and you're done.
Okay.
I totally agree with Gil there. I think that it's generally the best idea to just go with the happy paths. I would add also that like there are like a really common problem that people have with end-to-end tests is they say, oh, it's just so slow and it's so finicky. And that's like, often that's true. And it's lots of the problem is the tools that we've had with Cypress, that lots of those problems kind of go away. But one other thing, whether you're using a modern tool or not, is we often will like do the same actions over and over and over again in our tests. So like you want to keep your tests isolated from each other so they're not impacting the results of other tests. You can run them in isolation and all that in parallel and everything. But that doesn't mean that you have to do the same action. So like if you need a user, then that doesn't mean you have to register that user, log in as that user, and go through that whole flow. You could just before your test runs, make a database query or hit a special endpoint that sets up all that state for your test, and then you start your test in that situation. So yeah, you definitely want to have at least one test that goes through the registration flow and stuff. But once you've tested that, you've tested it. You don't need it anymore. And I think that this is one of the reasons why you'll hear people talk about page objects, is because they're doing these kinds of things over and over again. So they want to make it easy to do that. Whereas if you're just testing it once, then you don't need a page object because like it's just in one test anyway. So if you don't know what page objects are, that's totally fine because you don't need to. Don't worry about them. But yeah, generally, like if you can like initialize your app in the state and like make some database calls or whatever before your test starts to initialize your app in a state for that test, then you don't need to retest the same things over and over again, and your end-to-end test will be a lot faster.
Now, have you ever had that be an exploit vector? Like, how do you isolate that type of thing from the production environment? You know what I'm saying? Like, if you need to make a special endpoint that just does something that's outside of the standard, you know what I'm talking about?
I totally know what you're getting at. So generally, like most of the time, these tests are going to be things that are run not in production. It's definitely a good idea to have some tests that run on a regular basis in production, but that would be your bulk of your test suite. And so yeah, I probably wouldn't want to expose an endpoint like that, even if it's authenticated or protected in some way. Probably wouldn't be the best idea to expose an endpoint that could do certain things like that in production, but certainly in your staging environment or something like that is where generally you're going to be running these kinds of tests.
Right.
End-to-end automation tests tend to be the easiest to write, but they're horribly flaky and horribly slow. We should do as little as possible and start going down the stack. more integration tests, more unit tests. I cannot stress it enough. If you're getting to the point where end-to-end tests are becoming a problem because they're like tens of minutes, then I'm saying, I don't say it usually, but you're doing it wrong. You should have more integration tests, more unit tests.
Interesting.
And you know, this technology has been underrepresented. I think either it's implicitly people assume that it's there, or it hasn't been talked about. But JS DOM, which is the ability to simulate a DOM, almost a browser, in your node environment, for me has completely revolutionized the way we do front-end testing. I mean, it's a revolution that has not been explicitly made a revolution. The fact that I can do integration tests that have multiple components and AJAX calls and everything and running in milliseconds is a total revolution. For these kinds of tests, I used to be able to do them only in Selenium, Cypress, whatever, in end-to-end tests, and those were really flaky. Now we can do them in integration tests and unit tests. So total revolution. We should do that more and more and more. JS DOM is the bomb. For me.
Yeah, JS DOM is the bomb.
The bomb, yeah.
Whoa. Trademark. JS DOM is the bomb. Man, I can't tweet that.
I remember, like, before JS DOM was more widely used and accepted, and before it was like really much of a thing, using Karma to, or I actually, my first experience with testing in JavaScript was pulling up I had an index HTML file that loaded Mocha and a couple my chai and things, and then I had another script file for my tests, and I'd refresh the browser anytime I wanted to rerun my tests, and it was great. It was awesome. I was like, sweet, I have pretty good confidence that this library is working, and but I had, like, it was such a manual process, and like I had no idea what code coverage was, like, and like tons and tons of things. And then over time we started getting better and better, and now the JavaScript ecosystem is just in such an amazing place with Jest and these and JS DOM and the coverage tools that we have now. Just, it's fantastic. I like, oh man, the path getting here was really frustrating and tough. Like, I had a whole talk that explained how you can get ES6 with Babel and Webpack and Karma and working. Like, the first part wasn't a big deal, but once you start adding code coverage with all that stuff, it was a total nightmare. So I had a whole talk about this, and now with Jest, it's just like, just add the flag -- coverage and you're done. It's so good. And you don't need to set up like this weird thing in Travis so that Karma will work. It's just like, it's all JS DOM. It's all in Node. It's, yeah, we're in a pretty good and happy state with our unit and integration tests now, I think. And things are getting even better with Cypress and end-to-end testing too.
So tell me a little bit more about Cypress. I have not had an opportunity to really use Cypress.
Yeah, sure. So Cypress is a really interesting tool. Before, the test drivers were like Selenium, where it basically is this this Java app thing that can fire, and it doesn't have to be in Java, but like it can fire these different events at an actual browser to simulate the user's behavior. That's the idea, and that's like the pinnacle of using or automating the way that a manual tester would test your software. So you get a ton of confidence from that, because like you can't get much closer to manual testing than like actually clicking around on the browser. Mm-hmm. The problem with it is it's pretty hard to write tests for something like that. You had a lot of even when you're using a live application as a regular user, when you click on a button, you have to wait a certain amount of time. And we as users know how long to wait because we can see what's going on and things. But your tests, your automated tests, like this stuff is just running like one after the other and whatever. And so you have like earlier on, before the tools got better, you'd have these random sleeps all over the place where it's like, okay, click on this button now, sleep for, I don't know, 200 milliseconds, and you know,
probably enough time, right?
Yeah, like it worked on my machine, and then it goes into production, and then there's some problem with the network or something, and your tests start failing, and you're like, oh, somebody broke something. Oh no, they didn't break something. There's just a flaky network. Rerun it again, and everybody loses confidence in their tests, and it's just awful. And so nobody wants to write tests anymore because it's so hard. And they're flaky anyway, so nobody trusts them, and so you don't get confidence. So anyway, Cypress came around a couple of years ago with a kind of a different approach. Instead of having this thing that lives outside of the browser and is shooting stuff at the browser, and like getting a moment like inspection time at the browser and like, okay, what's the world look like now? And then, okay, what's it look like now? Cypress is actually running all of your tests and all of its code inside the same browser that your app is running in. And so because of that one feature alone, or that one architectural decision, it has a lot more insight into what's going on in the browser. And so you don't have to worry about sleeps or anything like that. It will take care of things for you. So in the way that Cypress works is you have this Sci object in your test that you issue commands to, and what you're doing is you're queuing up a whole bunch of like a list of commands. It's almost like you can think of it as writing down a list of commands on a piece of paper and then handing that off to the user. So you could almost think of the Sci global variable as user, and you hand this off to the user, and then the user goes off, checks one at a time, and waits until it's able to do that next one. So it says, oh, you want me to click on this button? Well, it's not on the page. Let me keep on waiting. Okay, now it's on the page. Now I can click on the button. Now I can move on to the next step. And so because of that functionality, or that design choice, it's a lot easier to write tests that read like a normal user would write them and follow those instructions. So the tests are a lot more maintainable. In addition, they are less flaky because because Cypress is able to know a lot more about what's going on in the browser environment. And on top of that, Cypress has really awesome capabilities for mocking the HTTP calls, because it's living in the browser there. And so you can actually write integration and even unit tests using Cypress. It's a fair amount slower than Jest, and so that's why I continue to use Jest. Also, Jest has a lot of really awesome features for watch mode and things like that. But Cypress is capable of doing those things, and so a lot of people are saying, hey, I'm going to do my end-to-end and my integration test with Cypress. Like, you can render just a specific component to the page and things. And then I'll do my unit test, my edge case testing stuff with Jest. I'm more in the integration and unit test with Jest, and then just end-to-end with Cypress. Yeah, anyway, that's the basic idea. There's also the Cypress testing library that I created based off of DOM testing library. And so it can read as simple as like sci.get by label text username .type Kent C Dodds .get by username, or get by label text password .type I love Twix, and then and then get by text, and then submit, and then .click. And so it reads really easy. You just read top to bottom. You know exactly what's going on in the test, and then Cypress will take care of making it all work as closely as the user would use it as possible.
What Cypress is Chromium, right?
Yeah, that's probably good to throw out there. So this is the part where lots of people get really sad, but so Cypress is amazing, but because it's actually running in the browser, it takes a lot more work for it to, and because they're not standing on the shoulders of the giants of the Selenium, all the work that's been done into that, they have to build in the integrations for other browsers. And so right now, the Cypress is actually an Electron app, and the test runs right next to the browser that you're actually running in, which is actually pretty cool, because you could do test-driven development with your end-to-end test, because you're actually looking at the browser. You can interact with the browser, like all of that stuff that you couldn't possibly do with Selenium. Yeah, so it's an Electron app, and it loads up Chrome in the Electron app. And right now it does not support anything else. So you can run Electron and you can run Chrome. But I believe there's a pull request open right now for support with Firefox. And then there's also a, I know that there has been some work to investigate Internet Explorer, or at least Edge. Maybe they'll never support IE. I'm not sure. I certainly wouldn't want to, but I'm pretty sure there's been some investigative work on Edge. and then there will be Safari. So it doesn't actually support mobile browsers. You can change the viewport to be the size of a mobile browser, but yeah, it doesn't support mobile browsers yet. So there's a lot of places it doesn't support. But my argument back to any concerns about that is modern browsers are so close to one another now that any bugs that you would find, or any bugs that you'll get that are as a result of differences to modern browsers, are going to be things that you probably wouldn't have had a test for anyway. And so I don't feel like it's worth like just dumping the baby out with the bathwater by saying, oh, it doesn't support all the browsers, so I'm going to get that last tiny sliver of confidence and go with Selenium, when at the end of the day, you'll probably have fewer tests that are less reliable with Selenium. And so you'll probably actually have less confidence, even though it runs in all the browsers. That's great, but you'll still have less confidence than if you were just to stick with Cypress and write a lot more that are much more reliable. And then maybe you can write like a test or two with Selenium to make sure that have something that runs in all the browsers. But I would really encourage people to give Cypress a very solid look and not worry too much about cross-browser support, because this is not the web of like 2000 or the 90s or whatever. This is a new web that we're living in these days.
I totally agree, and for me, Cypress is like the gist of the automation world. It has everything. It's amazing. Lots of convenience functions by this and by this and this. The whole GUI thing where you can see for each of the actions that you put, like click, etc., what was the state of the page at that time. It enables you to debug your tests a lot cleaner. It's really well thought out as a package, and there's extensions, plugins, etc., which are really, really great. I do have to admit that Selenium is still the only game in town for cross browsers, and it's not that bad in terms of flakiness. It does also have the idea of implicit waits, where it's waiting for an element to appear, etc. It's not that bad, but definitely Cypress as a package is really, really comprehensive and really fun to write tests with.
Cool. What about snapshot testing? I know it was all the rage, and I kind of got into it. Depending on the thing I'm working on, I've found it very useful. Like, like lately I've been doing some personal compiler stuff, and I've found it really great for that, because it's like I'll generate an AST, or I'll generate the WebAssembly bytecode output, and I just snapshot test it. I verify that it looks correct, and I don't have to manually write the WebAssembly by hand to match it. So I've found it works well. But when you're doing like DOM stuff, I'm wondering how useful it is. What do you guys think in practice?
I'm not a fan.
Not a fan. Yeah, okay.
I always kind of tend to think that I'm testing the implementation. And so whenever I change, I change a div to a span or whatever, then yeah, the test breaks, and then I change the snapshot, and we're done. I'm not exactly sure what I'm testing. This brings me to visual testing, which we'll talk about later. What I really want is to test how the component looks like, and not so much, what elements it's composed of in the DOM. Not a fan. I tried it a little bit. Basically threw those tests away once I figured out that I'm not really testing anything.
Yeah, I'm kind of with Gil here. Jay, I'm totally on board with you with generated code and stuff like that.
Yeah.
So my Babel plugins, all of them use snapshots. Like I can't even imagine what it would be like to write. Like I wouldn't write tests. I'd just be like, right, well, this works this one time that I tried it. Because yeah, it'd be just so prohibitively difficult to write tests for something like that. So like I'll make a snapshot. Here's the before code. Here's the after code. It's so easy to review those. But yeah, with I think snapshot testing is great for when you want to do a big refactor on code that doesn't have any tests at all. And so you're gonna, okay, I'll take a snapshot of this thing. Now I'm gonna do this huge refactor. And how does the snapshot compare? It's a lot easier for me to see, oh, that changed. That's not a big deal. That's kind of like, that's a necessary change. So we can update that. That's fine. But the danger comes in where people are just like, so with Jest, you're in watch mode and you're making changes. And when there's a snapshot failure, all you have to do is hit the U key and the test passes again. And it's like magic. And it totally is. It's this euphoric feeling that you have like, oh, my tests are passing. Awesome. And you wind up with this, 3,000 line file with all these changes, and you push that up to GitHub and say, hey, everybody, check, review my pull request. And they're, oh, I'm busy. Okay, I'll just hurry really quick. Oh, he probably reviewed this really quick, so I'll just merge that. And now, like, it's actually worse than not having any tests at all, because you think that you're confident, but you're actually not. And so you're not motivated to write better tests because you think that you have good enough tests. So I wouldn't say that snapshot testing is worthless. There's definitely value in it. One other problem that I have with snapshots is it's hard to determine what part of the snapshot is important for the test. And so you could have like 10 tests for this component, and you say, okay, when the user starts typing, the dropdown opens up, and you take a snapshot of that state. And then you have another test that the dropdown closes. But there's a whole bunch of other DOM stuff like in that snapshot that is totally irrelevant to your test, and it's duplication from other snapshots. And so you don't know like which part of this snapshot actually matters. And so when the snapshot breaks, you don't know, like, is it a bad thing that that snapshot broke or not? I don't really know. So I think it's okay if you want to snapshot. What I generally do is I'll say, okay, feel free to snapshot, but only snapshot the part of the component or the output that is relevant for your test. And what happens is, as you start narrowing down, okay, I'm going to query down to this one element or whatever, and I'm going to snapshot that, then you realize, oh, wait, I could just like assert that the text content is what I expect it to be. And now it's just a regular assertion. You don't need a snapshot anymore.
Right.
So like, feel free to start with a snapshot, then just whittle it down to just the area. And maybe it's a couple of divs and things that you're like, yeah, this is what I want to make sure it doesn't break. And it's totally cool. But yeah, I am hesitant to just say, yeah, snapshot all the things. They are good at it in some situations, but often they generally tend to create a team culture that is unhealthy for testing.
So we had a question. Someone asked about testing pure functions. They've got a pure function that sometimes, depending on the specifics of the inputs, will sometimes take a heuristic and do something a different way that's much more performant. And so it does the exact same thing, just does it a different way that ends up being the only difference is the performance of it. So they're wondering, how do they test that? I have my own thoughts, but because you can't, obviously you can't detect the difference in the output, because the output's going to be the same. It's just it performed differently.
Well, I actually have an interview question on that. How do you test the performance? And you don't really want to test the performance. You want to test whether it's an ON, a big ON, or big ON squared, or big ON log n, or whatever. And the way you test that is you give pure functions are the best. I mean, I try to make as much as possible of my code pure, because they're so easy to test. You just put in input, you get the output, you check it, and you're done. But in terms of performance, what I would do is I would start with a small data set, to give it to the function, check how much time it does, then a bigger one, and then like sort of graph it and see whether it fits the curve of ON, which is linear, and ON squared, which is like a parabola, etc., etc., etc. That's what I would do, and that's what I did, I think, about once. It's not common.
When you say graph it, you don't. When you're talking automated tests, you don't mean physically actually graph it.
No, not graph it, but figure out whether it's on the curve, on the right curve. Yeah.
Right. And
it's
so
difficult.
And just to clarify, you were talking about big O notation for anyone who's listening, right? So
yes, big O notation,
which represents the complexity of a pure function.
Yeah, it's horrible, because whenever I need to time a function, let's say make it happen in less than whatever, always in CI you get these failures and timeouts. It's horrible.
God, yes.
Oh, it's the worst. I tend to just look at the function and say, yeah, that's big ON or big ON squared, and be done with it.
Right. Yeah, my advice was just going to be similar, but I mean, it's very rarely worth it. Like there's just so much work that has to be done. I mean, if you really, really need to know, I feel like the ugly but easy way of doing it is using some sort of like not dependency injection per se, but just pass in like have like some sort of structure, or like, you know, basically like you pass in to the function the two possible code paths essentially as continuations or some sort of class or something like that, and depending on the input it will choose which one, and you can use those mocks to decide that it actually did choose the correct one. But again, I don't know. It would really depend on the actual specific situation of what this function is doing, whether that's even worth doing.
Yeah. And you know, sometimes tests just aren't worth it. They're just not worth it.
Yeah. What do you think, Kent?
I probably wouldn't test it, but I'm not like much of a like I don't get into really hardcore performance optimization, and at least not something like that could be tested in that way. Yeah, like maybe I would be interested in some performance test that's like with Lighthouse or something like that. But from the sound of this question, it's like I have an algorithm that takes a more performant path given certain scenarios or something. Like maybe what you could do if you just want to get coverage on that code is extract that performant part to another function, and you can test that in isolation. But yeah, for me, I don't have much experience with that. I probably wouldn't test it explicitly. Just let it be.
Let it ride. Yeah, testing performance stuff is tough. We ran benchmarks for RxJS for quite a while to make sure that every PR would not regress it and stuff, and it was just so flaky. Like it would just go up and down for no reason that we could tell, and we're just like, you change documentation and then now the PR fails. Like you're like, oh great. So we've got JC is asking a question about they just started a junior job and have been tasked with setting up a new React environment for a rewrite. And they have no experience testing, so they want to know what's the best junior-friendly resource for React tests. I assume for learning how to set it up and learning for even what you need to do, like what testing even means, I guess. Kent probably has literally tons of resources about this, like your own resources that you can point to, right?
Yeah. So I've got a lot of stuff. So there's yeah, there are just trying to think of the best. If you go to my website, kentcdodds.com, and click on talks and workshops, look at those two pages. Well, look all over the place. I also probably have stuff on there on like the podcasts that I've been on and stuff. But yeah, so I have some material for learning about testing. I also have, like, if you want to buy a subscription to Front End Masters, I just released a new updated version of my React testing course. And then right now, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I'm working on a course for Egghead. It's going to be like 60 or 80 videos or something. It's insane. Yeah, so that'll be coming. I can't give an estimate because I'll just let you down. But eventually. Eventually that'll come. Yeah, let's see. Also, React testing library has some good examples, and we're adding more. And the cool thing about React testing library is that it actually runs in the browser, and so there's a code sandbox that you can pull up and look at those examples and play around with them and stuff to see kind of how to use it. The nice thing about React testing library that I found that I was never super happy with other abstractions was that the API is just so natural that it makes it easier to test things. And so once you pick up React testing library, it should like with a little bit of practice and experience with React and with DOM APIs and things, as well as general JavaScript, then it should come more naturally over time. So give that a look as well.
I certainly don't have the amount of output that Kent has, which is amazing. So first of all, I would definitely refer a junior programmer to Kent's site. There's lots of information. But if they want a more concise and smaller, then on my blog, my Medium blog, so look for Medium Gil Tayar, then you will find a series of 6 or 7 blog posts which detail a recipe for writing front-end tests, an introduction, then we talk about unit tests, integration, end-to-end, and with visual tests. It's a good intro. Lots of people seem to like it. So maybe you can start with that and then go to Kent's stuff for the real meat, definitely.
Cool. Thanks, Gil. I posted the link that you mentioned in the chat.
Thank you.
So, Gil, you do a lot of visual testing, and that's really, the Applitools, the place you work, that's your bread and butter. Tell us a little bit about that. What is visual testing?
Yeah, people ask me, visual testing, where is it in the pyramid? Is it above end-to-end, below end-to-end, whatever? And my answer is no. It's part of the pyramid. There are visual component tests, visual integration tests, and visual end-to-end tests. And first of all, what is it exactly? And for me, and it's the reason I joined Applitools, visual testing is the missing piece of the puzzle. I mean, we're testing functionality all along, all day. We're testing whether this button works or that button works, whether this link works or that link works, but we don't test that the button is red, as it should be, or green, or whatever. We don't test how the application looks like. And up to like a few years ago, we couldn't really. People did the baseline thing where they took a screenshot, took it as a baseline, and the next thing they compared those 2 images, which kind of sort of works until you start scaling with more and more people in the team and more machines, and then you start getting those false negatives because the images don't align exactly and there's anti-aliasing differences, etc. So people threw away those as, oh, that's fake, it doesn't work. But Applitools came with this secret sauce. I'm not sure how it works. I'm not an algorithm person, where they try and compare the 2 images as a human would. So it ignores the little anti-aliasing changes. If the whole thing moves by 1 pixel, that's fine. And all those, there's like we have this team of three AI people, machine learning, deep learning. They're totally into that, and that is what they do. Once we have that, which is the basis, you can really start doing visual testing, testing how your application looks like, and just getting rid of that problem and not just doing manual testing, because that is basically what we're doing. The only way we're doing visual testing currently is manual testing. And if you're into confidence and testing, then visual testing is a crucial and necessary part, because that is what your users see. So yeah, definitely check out Applitools. There are other tools out there that are all great, but I believe the Applitools secret sauce is what makes the difference between testing that is fine and testing that works.
And so you were mentioning that it's across all the stacks. So that's you
right.
Actually can write unit tests.
Right. So yeah, we've been concentrating on end-to-end with Selenium, and we're going to come out with Cypress SDK in a short while, because most of our customers are currently testers. But we're now starting to target developers, and we were thinking of how do we do that, because end-to-end are so slow. People don't want to do developers don't want to do visual testing on end-to-end tests, and I agree. So we were thinking about how we do component testing, which is basically just DOM testing, and do visual testing. How can we don't have a browser, we have just Node. How can we take that and do visual testing on it? And the answer is you can't, unless somebody else renders those components. And so we now have what we call the visual grid, which is a grid on our cloud of hundreds of browsers that our SDKs upload that DOM, upload all the resources, the images, the CSS, etc., and we render that component for you across our hundreds of browsers. And that also takes care of the speed, because if you have 30, 40, 50 JS DOM tests, you can add visual tests to them, and we render them in parallel. So instead of taking minutes for each component, now you're literally taking about seconds and tens of seconds. And this is I'm really enthusiastic about it. This is why I joined Applitools. The ability to do visual testing for components on JS DOM. It's currently a work in progress. You're mostly seeing, but the SDK, the Cypress SDK that we're taking out is using that visual grid. So if you add like tens of checks, of visual checks in your test, they'll take the same amount of time because we're running them in parallel on our grid. It's a great thing.
And I believe you guys have some automated systems for testing things like Storybook, right? Where you don't need to do hardly anything.
Yeah, we started with Storybook because a lot of testers don't test, unfortunately. So we thought, okay, how do we introduce them to visual testing if they don't test? And our answer was let they do Storybook. So they have this really cool library of components that they show off and use to document their components, which is what Storybook is, the ability to document your component library. And wait, they already are showing those components in a Storybook. Then we can just grab that Storybook and visual test all the components. And because we're doing it with a visual grid, we're grabbing those components and rendering them in parallel. So it doesn't matter how many components, though that test will take tens of seconds and literally have 0 lines of code to run that test. So yeah, we started with Storybook, and I think it's a great start. And it's a great way to visually test all your components like in one big thing. And if you don't have Storybook, well, write a Storybook and you get two birds with one. Oh, that's not a politically correct term. 2 cakes with one flower.
Wait, that's not politically correct anymore?
2 birds with 1 stone? Come on, that's animal cruelty.
Yeah. So I don't think there are enough people here to cheer on Gil for what he's saying. So I'm gonna go, woo! This is so amazing to me. Like, so Gil and I talked on. I've gone to my YouTube channel. We recorded our chat with him, and so it's just incredible. So you one of the prohibitively difficult things about testing across multiple platforms is that how many platforms you have to test across, and how long it takes to run all of those tests. And so like, let's say you have a test suite that takes an hour long, and now you have to run that across like hundreds of different browsers, I guess. Like, you got mobile browsers and then desktop browsers and all the permutations of all those. It's a silly amount. And so being able to just say, here's my DOM and all my assets and everything, and just ship it up, and they do it on their cloud, like instant fast, that, like, right there, that's a huge amount of confidence that you can get, that your stuff looks the way that it should. I'm a huge fan of the idea. I haven't used it yet, but I just think it's the coolest idea. So thanks for your work there at Applitools. I think it's great.
Thank you. From you, it's a huge compliment. Thanks, Ken.
Cool. So Kent, have you done visual testing using something else maybe in the past, or have experimented? I know I experimented with this manual screenshotting stuff years and years ago, and had the same problems that Gil was talking about, and abandoned it.
Yeah. So there was this tool by Instagram. I remember Pete Hunt talking about it. I think called Huxley, I think is what it was called. Yeah, so that was fun. I tried it once and I was like, wow, this is really hard to set up. And so I abandoned it. And then Snapshot testing came around. I was like, okay, sweet. This is the nice like middle ground, because visual regression testing is too hard. So Snapshots, I mean, it's not as good, but it's still like, it's okay. Yeah, so I haven't done anything since I tried with Huxley, because it was too hard. But it sounds like Applitools is making it really good. And we should find a link to that. I'll look for a link to that chat, because they demoed for me lots of the really awesome features, which include like AI driven diffs. So lots of the problem with visual regression testing is there's dynamic content, or there's just stuff that changes in very subtle ways, and you get failing tests all the time. So you're back to this idea of like, oh, well, just check it off because it's always changing anyway, and so you get lazy. But with what they have, it's a lot more intelligent, and so when there's a failure, it's because something failed, not because the tool is having some trouble. which is like a really critical part of any testing tool. You want to make sure that any failure is a result of an actual failure in your code rather than a failure of the tool. So anyway, I think it's just really awesome. I just haven't had a chance to try it out yet.
Cool.
I hope you know that Applitools will make visual testing mainstream as it did in the tester community. It'll take a while, but I think we'll get there.
Very nice. Well, I think that's about all the time we have today, unless anyone has any last minute thoughts they wanted to say. Oh, cool. Great. Well, thanks everyone for joining me. And again, my name is Jay Phelps. You can find me on Twitter at _Jay Phelps. And you can find Kent on Twitter. Kent, what's your Twitter handle?
I'm Kent C Dodds everywhere.
Kent C Dodds, Chimichanga. What does the C stand for, Chimichanga?
Sure. No, it's Christopher.
Oh, it's Chimichanga.
Oh,
And
yeah.
Gil?
Gil Tayar, I'll spell it out. It's not common. GILTAYAR. That's everywhere. Again, Medium, LinkedIn, everywhere. Twitter.
Great. Awesome. And I wanted to give a little shout out to my employer, ThisDot, who sponsors these podcasts. And so if we do developer relations, we do support contracts, we do staff augmentation, that type of stuff. So we also do RX Workshop as well. So if any of that stuff's interesting to you, give us a shout out. And I'll see you guys all next time. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.